Welcome to our 5 on 5. Please be joined today by Meesha Blair with the National Alliance of Mental Illness Southern Oregon. You are the Advocacy Chair, correct?
Correct.
Thanks for being here. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So it is a busy week in the conversation about the Jackson County Jail. I believe both Ashland and Talent are voting on it this week, and that will determine whether or not this is something that could go in front of voters next year, which is what the county's hoping for. So we have a very nuanced conversation today because we're talking about mental illness, and I guess first off, is NAMI Southern Oregon supporting the idea of a new jail?
Right, so that is a nuanced question right there. So NAMI has some very specific goals around the intersection between mental health and law enforcement, and that includes diversion out of jail to begin with, and then correct mental health services within the jail if they are in jail. So we are supporting improvements to any internal support systems for mentally ill in the jail, but we're choosing to be neutral on the whole proposal, this measure that's up before the city councils this week.
Okay, and I guess point blank, and I don't know if this is a yes or no question, should the Jackson County Jail be responsible for the mentally ill?
Right. So that is a very complex question. I wish I could answer yes or no because I'd love to say no.
It's not easy.
But yeah, it's not easy. And a lot of times folks with mental illness end up in the jail, and we have not a lot of alternative places for them to go. So if they're going to end up there, then we need to have the proper supports for mental health inside the jail. But really, NAMI is always promoting what we call treatment before tragedy.
Okay, what is that?
So we want the treatments upstream, ability to screen and identify issues before 911 even has to be called. We want to get them services before something tragic happens. And if something tragic does happen and it's due to a mental illness, we want that to be treated. And incarceration is not a healing environment.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that people often have to raise their hand, in effect, to get that sort of treatment, or to get maybe committed to, lack of a better phrase. But do they not have to volunteer to get treatment?
It depends on the situation, but
Sure.
Most of the time, yes, it has to be voluntary. There is a system called civil commitment, but that's another can of worms.
Sure.
And it's
We've only
pretty
got so much time.
complicated.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to get. So it's quite unusual for that to happen. It has to be at the point of imminent danger to themselves or others, and that can be pretty hard to prove. So. Okay,
and so you mentioned diversion. Is there a gap in services for the mentally ill here in Jackson County, in your opinion?
Well, I think the fact that the jail is having to operate as a de facto mental health hospital would argue that there is some gaps. I believe that there are a lot of people with great ideas in the county, and it's really an issue of funding. And sometimes a little bit of funding up front, invested up front, can save us quite a lot down the road. And that's why we brought the examples from Eugene and from Marion County on their diversion programs. And a key element in both of their formats for that is a 24/7 psychiatric crisis resource center where law enforcement can take folks that are having mental illness issues, but they're not at that critical acute stage that they need to be for the hospital. So
for example, here, like the 2 North at Assalte.
Right, exactly. Okay. So it would be between jail and the emergency room, would be all of these folks in between. And they have had very good experience with that, both in Eugene and Marion County. Marion County reduced their bookings by 25% when they started their program, and CAHOOTS saved $7 million in just emergency rooms over 1 year because of their diversion program.
And these are part of the criminal justice system, if you will, or I mean,
Yeah.
these are not facilities or anything that are at the jail.
Exactly.
But there are other services being offered in individual counties.
They're actually collaborations between law enforcement and Health and Human Services. So they partner up very closely. In CAHOOTS, they have separate vans that are not law enforcement, but they're funded by law enforcement dollars. So they're still linked to that, although they don't look like law enforcement, which can have an impact on how people respond to them. And then in Marion County, they partner up with a health and human service person and a law enforcement person, and they ride along together. Dispatch helps them figure out which of those calls are going to be appropriate for their team to respond to. So they'll assess it, and then when the team gets there, they'll assess it again. And by the time they've gotten through their assessment, it turns out that only about 3% of those calls that are answered by those teams end up in arrests.
Well, I know it's a complicated conversation that we're having, especially for a nonpartisan organization,
Right.
but I appreciate you coming by and breaking it down for
I
us. Good
really
to see you.
appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, stay with us. We'll be right back.